Classically trained musicians intuitively know the benefits and the importance of good dynamics. Sheet music is typically written with key, tempo, and dynamics information clearly noted. Song dynamics are essential. They are one of the primary factors contributing to the emotional experience for the listener. Sadly, unlike classically trained musicians, the typical worship team member has not been trained in proper dynamics. Most worship teams that I have observed think of dynamics in one of two main ways. Either they believe everyone plays all of the time, creating a sort of freight train forte, or they think lower parts are slower parts and bigger parts have the need for speed, creating a musical roller coaster for the listener. Now, neither of these ideas of dynamic expression is correct, helpful, or even musical. There is a better, more effective way, and it's not difficult to grow in this area as an individual and as a worship team. Let's look at a few suggestions that will help to that end on today's Weekly Worship Thoughts. Probably the best and the most effective way to grow as an individual and as a worship team in dynamics is to simply map out the song. Listen to or play through the song and intentionally think about what each instrument should do during each section. What should happen in the intro? When should the drums come into the song, and with what kind of beat? I like to use a simple table chart that includes each section of the song in the top row and then each instrument listed in the left column. And as I think through each section of the song, I simply fill in what each instrument should be doing at that point. Some examples could be whole note strumming in the guitar category, 16th note plucking perhaps in the bass guitar, or arpeggios up the octave for the electric guitar, maybe low pad for the keyboard, possibly quarter note kick only in the drums, maybe even say nothing, or whatever is happening in the song. Another practical way to help the worship team get on the same page when it comes to dynamics is to include dynamics information on your chord sheet. Most worship teams do not use sheet music, which is fine, especially since most worship team members don't know how to read sheet music anyway. The typical worship leader will give simple chord sheets to their team members, and these chord sheets typically consist of lyrics and chords, typically the acoustic guitar chords. Now, a slightly more thought out version of a chord sheet will include arrangement, tempo, and song key information. Before handing out the chord sheet, consider adding pertinent dynamics information. You can easily take this information from your map of the song if you took the time to listen through and map out the individual parts. Even after you've mapped out the parts and you've included that information on your song sheet, take time to talk through the arrangement before playing. At the beginning of your typical practice or rehearsal, take the first 10 to 15 minutes and just talk through the songs. I would recommend doing this without instruments in hand. Gather everyone together and just walk through the song chord sheets, hopefully with the dynamics information added. And make sure that everyone understands how the song should flow, when they should and shouldn't play, how you will begin and end each song, and anything else that you think is relevant to communicate at this point. I think it is important to note that you don't need to communicate every single piece of information to the worship team. I would not hand out my personal song map at this point. That's simply too much information. Only communicate what you think is necessary and helpful. If you really want to nail dynamics, practice with a metronome. Whether it is personal practice or worship team practice, make sure you are spending ample time with a metronome. This habit helps to ensure that you are not using tempo fluctuation to attempt dynamics change. When you first implement this strategy, you will probably notice yourself or your worship team speeding up at the big parts and slowing down for the smaller parts of the song. This typically translates to slow verses and fast choruses with a super speedy bridge. Long builds will be especially troublesome, but the more practice you can have with a metronome, the better you will be without one. If you employ these helpful suggestions, I promise you will begin to craft more dynamic song arrangements, which will translate into more powerful times of worship. So much of what we talked about revolves around this idea of taking the time to listen through a song and map out the individual parts. So what does that actually look like? How do you practically do it? Well, let's go ahead and listen through a song together, taking the time to map out the individual parts. This is a song from Polen Band called Because of the Cross. We'll listen through and then I'll stop to let you know what I'm hearing and to jot down some notes. So you could easily replicate this same basic idea or arrangement in your own context. Let's get started. So I'm hearing the acoustic guitar strumming the chord progression lightly. There's one electric guitar playing a signature riff. There is a second electric guitar lightly arpeggiating. The bass guitar is following the chord progression with whole notes. The piano is also lightly playing whole notes with a few additional notes in the middle there. And at this point, there are no vocals or drums. Now let's go ahead and listen to that intro again and try to hear each of those parts. Here in the first verse, the acoustic guitar, bass guitar, piano, and second electric guitar are all basically doing the very same thing they were doing in the intro. The main electric guitar is now playing nice, slow-strummed whole notes along the chord progression as well, and of course the vocals are prominent in the mix. In this particular recording, you can really hear the gang vocals, which is meant to emulate a congregation singing along, but there are not really any harmony vocals at this point. Let's listen to that again.
He has made the sacrifice, and through his death we now have life. Because of the cross we've been made spotless.
Okay, now we have the drums coming in with that eighth note floor tom thing happening, boom, and light quarter note hits on the ride. I'm hearing some light harmony vocals now behind the melody. The main electric guitar and piano are both playing a bit of a counter melody now, and it's actually really pretty. The other instruments are still pretty much doing the same thing they've been doing all along, and then there is a full measure break where basically just the acoustic guitar keeps playing, and at the end of that full measure break, we have the full band come in with another interlude, and the signature riff comes back in on the electric guitar. The piano continues in the counter melody, and we have a full drum beat with a tight roll on the snare, and the kick pattern is beginning to be established here in the interlude. The bass guitar will join that kick pattern in the second verse, but it's just continuing with whole notes here in the interlude. Let's go ahead and listen to all of that again through to the second verse. So what's making this verse bigger than the first verse is obviously the drums, but the main electric is also continuing with that little counter melody that was established in the first chorus. The bass is also matching the kick drum now, and overall this verse just feels bigger than the first one. But an important thing to remember is that this is not the biggest part of the song. So while it is building, there is still room to grow, and that's important. Too many times we get too big, too fast, and then there is simply nowhere left for us to go musically to continue with a dynamic build. So coming out of this second verse, we have a nice full measure drum roll to build into a second chorus, and now the drums have abandoned that snare roll and have replaced it with a full sounding, driving drum beat. The lead hand is on the hi-hat. The bass is really going to town now, adding some tasty fills between the kick beats. The bass is building towards playing constant eighth notes here, which it will end up using a bit in the bridge, taking the song up another notch. And you will also hear that the drums move from having the lead hand on the hi-hat to having the lead hand on the crash cymbal. The song is huge in the bridge.
Jesus, we thank you for your love, washing over us because of the cross.
The song comes way back down now at the end of the bridge and goes back to basically where it was for the first chorus. In this particular recording, it will build again, but I think this is a great place to end our exercise and a great place to end the song for the typical congregation.
Have purpose through his love, we've been set free.
What was one interesting truth or idea that stood out to you today, and how do you think that truth or idea will help you in the future? As a worship team, do you think you tend to use good, average, or poor dynamics during a typical song? Why do you feel this way? As an individual, What do you do to ensure that you are helping to create good musical dynamics as you contribute to the overall sound that the entire worship team is making? Have you ever fallen into the trap of thinking that dynamically low parts of a song are actually slower in tempo, and dynamically high parts of a song are actually faster in tempo? Why is this way of thinking completely wrong? What do you think about the idea of mapping out the song? Do you think this idea would help you as an individual or as a team to create better dynamics?